Hello, art students. Today we're going to finish talking about glazes. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some different ways to have success as you're glazing your pieces, as well as a little bit about color theory, and then what you've been waiting for, the steps on how to glaze. I got most of my information from an article called 12 Tips for Success in Ceramic Glazing by Annie Kreetzberg. So if you want to check out my source material, you can find that article on Google. We're going to begin by just glossing over color theory. Hopefully you have taken Art 1 and you have learned a little bit about color theory in that class. If you have never heard of color theory before, I encourage you to do some independent research and to find some videos or some websites that talk about this. There are tons of resources out there that will go much more in depth than I will in the next 2 slides. So the first thing you need to know about color theory is that the primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. You cannot mix those colors. To get the colors red, you have to have the color red. To get the color blue, you have to have the color blue. And to get the color yellow, you have to have the color yellow. You also cannot make the color white. So if you want to make any other color, you can make those by combining white, red, blue, and yellow. The secondary colors are created by combining 2 primary colors together equally. The secondary colors are green, orange, and violet. Primary and secondary are the first 2 color schemes. So that means that you can always use any combination of red, yellow, and blue, and it will look harmonious. You can also use any combination of green, orange, and violet, and it will look harmonious. For the sake of correctness, I will try to say violet every time that I mean the color purple. If you say purple, that's fine, but it's actually not the correct term. The other color scheme that is really useful when decorating your ceramics is complementary colors. Think of Christmas colors. That is red and green. The reason those colors are used together and the reason they work so well is because they're complementary, which means they are actually directly opposite each other on the color wheel. The color wheel is arranged to help us understand relationships between colors. Another example of a complementary color scheme is blue and orange. Another example of a complementary color scheme is yellow and purple. Think of a lot of sports teams' logos. They are usually using complementary colors because when you use 2 complementary colors, they will really stand out next to each other because they're opposites. So how can you be successful when glazing? Besides picking colors that look good together, you need to think about the thickness of your glaze. If you make your glaze too thick, it will crack and flake off as it dries. If you make your glaze too thin, the color will be inconsistent once the piece is fired. How many coats should you use? 2 to 3 coats. Go ahead and tell yourself that you always need to do 3 coats of glaze. If you only use 2 coats, it will probably be too thin. If you're using a really dark color, then sometimes you can get away with 2 coats. If the glaze that you're using is a little thin, sometimes you need 4 coats to make a thick enough layer on your pot. If you open a jar and the glaze is all dried up, then we can actually reconstitute or recycle the glaze just like we do clay by adding water. Please never do this on your own. Always ask me for help. What happens if you don't glaze your piece correctly and it sticks to the shelf? That's not okay. It gets broken. To remove it from the shelf, I have to break it. It also breaks the shelf, and the shelves cost at least $65 a piece, and I will make you pay for it if your piece is the one that broke it. So please make sure that you glaze your pieces correctly. So how do you make sure that you glaze your pieces correctly? Always use good glazes. Make sure that you do not glaze the bottom of your pieces. That is called dry foot glazing, and that is the technique that we use in this shop. If you ever have a piece where you have to glaze the bottom, such as a special in the round sculpture or the lid to your box, then we will use stilts to raise your project. Make sure you tell me any special cases like that. There are several different methods for glazing pottery. The method that we will use in ceramics is brushing. It gives you absolute control and it lets you put the colors where you want. When you're applying glazes, it's very important that you apply evenly. Think of laying layers of glaze onto your project with the brush strokes. Glaze is not the same as paint. Two things that you deal with when applying glaze are water and gravity. When a bisque pot becomes too saturated with water, it won't accept glaze correctly. So use the least amount of water possible when you're cleaning, including when you're making corrections. If you're not careful and watchful, drips can run down the pot and ruin your design. So please make sure that you're paying attention to gravity as well as water. The supplies that you need when glazing are your bisqued piece, newspaper or a magazine, a brush for your glaze, a bottle of glaze, and a sponge. The sponge will be used to clean the handle of your brush as well as the bottom of your piece when you're finished. When you're glazing, the first thing that you need to do is wash your hands. Try to keep your bisqueware clean, but the oils from your skin and lotion can create resist spots on the glaze. So anytime that you're about to do this kind of work, make sure that your hands are clean. Notice that the person in the example picture is actually wearing gloves. The next thing that you need to do is check your piece for any sharp edges. If you have any sharp edges, take the sandpaper that I've given you and file down the piece so that it is nice and smooth. After you've sanded it, either rinse the piece quickly in the sink or wipe it with a damp sponge. You want to make sure that there is no dust left on your piece. If the piece is dusty, then glaze will not adhere correctly. The next thing that you need to do is rinse your piece or wipe your piece. Make sure there's no dust. Make sure that there are no greasy spots on your piece. If you are sanding your piece, please make sure that you do not breathe in clay dust. It is actually very bad for your health. If you are sanding your piece and you want to go ahead and wear one of the masks that you have to wear outside right now anyways, that's a great idea. Usually before the pandemic, I would just do this step outside. The next thing you want to do is check the consistency of your glazes. The worst thing is when you sit down to work with glaze and you either don't already have the colors that you need and you have to get up, or your glazes are too thick or too thin and you have to get up and swap them out. What you should do is always get all the colors that you need first and then check to make sure that the lids are screwed on correctly. You want the consistency of your glaze to be about the same as pancake batter. If there is dry glaze that is caked onto the sides of the top of the jar, you can kind of take the paintbrush and knock that into the glaze and then mix that in. If the glaze is too thin when you open it, if it sounds very watery and does not sound thick like pancake batter, then your glaze might be too thin to work with and may run off your pot in the kiln. Glaze that is too thick or that is hard to paint will not be consistent and will not look good after it's been fired. So if the glaze is too thick, please bring it to me so that I can add a little bit of water to it to thin it perfectly down. So the next thing that you want to do when you're glazing is apply your first coat of glaze. Notice that you did a lot of prep work before you actually started adding color to your pot. The smart thing to do is to glaze the interior of your pots first by pouring in the glaze and pouring it back out quickly or brushing it on. Next, you want to flip your piece over and paint the bottom side of it. Think of things like bowls and plates that have a foot. Leave the foot dry. The last thing you want to do is paint the outside. So tell yourself inside, bottom, outside. That way you never have to touch wet glaze. You always want to make sure that you check yourself in between each step. A lot of times glaze will move and drip and run while you are not looking. When you have glaze in an area that you do not want it, if you let it dry first, you can knock it off with a tool or with your finger. You can scrape off a drip that went in an area that is completely the wrong color with a metal tool or your wooden scraping tool. Another tool that you can use to clean up your mistakes is a damp sponge. You can remove remaining glaze with a few strokes. Use as little water as possible. The next thing you want to do is do your second coat and check your piece again. Always make sure that your piece is dry before you add another coat. If the glaze is shiny and wet, it is not dry. If the glaze looks matte, then the bisque has absorbed a lot of the water and you can add a second coat. If you add a coat before your piece is dry, you're not actually adding another coat of glaze, you're just smearing the glaze around that's already there. Always consider gravity and watch for drips as you work. You want your brush strokes to be very consistent when you're using low fire glazes. Try to go in a crisscross pattern. So for this first layer of glaze, I want you to think about painting up and down. Once that dries and you add a second layer of glaze, think about painting side to side. On your last coat, you probably want to paint up and down again, making sure that any areas where the glaze looks thin, you apply a little bit extra. And if there's an area where the glaze looks a little bit thick, you can actually take your thumb and rub some of it away. If you have texture or details, you can always take a clean, stiff paintbrush to clean out any details. The most important thing is to make sure that you let your piece dry in between coats. If you try to do your final coat before your piece is dry, then your piece will not turn out as beautiful as it could. Your final coat is when you need to be paying attention to the way your piece looks. Fix any areas where the glaze looks thin now. You want to apply the final thick coat very slowly. Occasionally stir your glaze to make sure that it has stayed mixed. Sometimes it could take up to 30 minutes for the second coat to dry, so during that time, some of the glaze matter has settled back down to the bottom of the jar. You can put the lid back on and shake it again, or you can just stir it with your paintbrush. If you let your paintbrush sit out and the glaze gets a little bit of dry on the paintbrush before you do your third coat, just take your paintbrush, dip it in the bottle of glaze, and stir it really good to reactivate the glaze that's on your paintbrush. Keep a large damp sponge nearby so that you can clean the brush handle. A lot of times drips comes from glaze building up on the handle and dripping down. The next thing you want to do is fix any mistakes. Notice that I'm saying that over and over because mistakes will happen, but if you're mindful of them, you can fix them before they become permanent. If you have an extreme disaster and really mess up your piece, you can actually wash the glaze off and start over. You don't want to do that too often because glaze is expensive and that's wasteful. But if there's one or two pieces that just really don't turn out the way you want them to, you can always wash them before they're put in the kiln. The last step is you want to check the bottom of your piece and place it on the shelf or bring it to Mrs. Cross. You're going to want to use a sponge and your finger to clean the bottom and the foot. If you accidentally put too much glaze on the bottom, you can use sandpaper to help you find the foot. See the image on the screen where the person is taking a sponge, their piece is flipped over, and they're actually wiping the glaze off of the bottom. Drip happens. If a drip onto a previously glazed surface forms, stop, set the pot down, and wait. Think about what happens, ladies, when you're putting on your makeup and you accidentally put mascara on the inside of your eye. If you try to clean it immediately, you're actually going to smear mascara all over your face and actually leave a black stain on your makeup. If you wait until the mascara has dried, you can probably pick it off with your fingernail. Glaze works exactly the same way. If you let any mistakes like a drip dry and then carefully scrape it off with the tool or the metal rib, then you can use a sponge to wipe away any little mistakes. It's much easier to fix one small mistake than a huge smear all across your piece of pottery. Don't leave drips. They will not go away. They will just look bad. A couple tips and tricks and reminders. Remember that you probably cannot mix glazes together. If you mix glazes together that are not compatible, you will get a disgusting, ugly brown. You can layer glazes. That is different than mixing glazes. So if you want to put down a dark color and then put a translucent color on top of it, that is perfectly acceptable. If you have a question about whether or not you can mix glazes, always ask me first. The color in the jar is not always the way that it's going to look after firing. Please always, 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 always read the label to make sure that you know what colors you're using and how they would turn out in the kiln. The other thing you want to do is write down the glaze that you use in your sketchbook. That way, if you like the way that it turns out in the kiln, you can use it again later. Brush hairs will burn off in the kiln, so don't worry if a brush sheds on your project. If you use a disgusting and dirty brush, you will contaminate the glaze. Glazes are very expensive, up to $20 a bottle. Think about how cheap your fee was and think about how expensive glaze is. Please don't contaminate my glaze. If you go to use a glaze, make sure that you have a clean, dry paintbrush. If you've freshly cleaned a paintbrush, then you can use a wet paintbrush and glaze. If you change colors, make sure that you clean the paintbrush when switching it from one glaze jar to another. Otherwise, the chemicals in one glaze could contaminate another one if they are not compatible. Please do not contaminate my glaze. Glaze application. Even application is the most important part. You will definitely be able to see your brush strokes in low fire glaze. Think about the way that it's going on in the kiln. The kiln is just heating it up. It's not going to magically make anything change about your artwork. You don't want to overbrush your glaze. Try blending and shading, but don't try painting with your glaze. It's not the same. You're layering it. These are the 10 steps for glazing in a slide all together. So if you missed some of the steps earlier, you can write them down from this slide. The two troublemakers when applying glaze are water and gravity. If you get your piece too wet, it will not accept glaze correctly. If you are not mindful of gravity, drips can run down your pot and ruin your design. Remember, color in the jar is not always the color that it will be after firing. Hopefully you remember all these tips and tricks about glaze, but if you ever forget anything, you're welcome to come back and watch this video again. In Ceramics 2, we will learn a little bit more about layering high fire glazes. For this first project, I definitely want you to stick to low fire glazes because they're a little bit easier to control. But the better you get at glaze, the more interesting and fun things you'll be able to do with the decoration process. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is how to actually glaze your piece. So the first thing you want to do is set up your workspace. So make sure that you have a piece of paper. I like to use old newspaper because glaze is going to drip even if you're very careful because of gravity. You also want to make sure that your piece is completely dry. So you watched me put it under the faucet earlier. I did that to make sure that there was not any dust left on the piece. Dust will make the glaze not adhere properly and it will come off of your piece in the kiln and it will just end up looking kind of gross. So you want to make sure that your piece is clean. You also want to make sure that your hands are clean. So before I start touching my piece and glazing, I always wash my hands to make sure that there are no oils on my hand. Our skin naturally has lots of oils on it, so always make sure that you have clean hands and you have a clean piece before you get started. Other than that, you want to think about the brushes that you're going to use. I like to use a fan brush because it covers a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. We also have these flat brushes that are nice, and we have smaller brushes for details. For your pinch pot, since it's your first piece that you're glazing, you probably want to stick to something pretty simple. So for mine, I'm going to do most of my piece with this opalescent glaze. It's a really pretty, shiny white color, and I think that will look good on my ceramic piece. For some of the details, I'm going to switch colors and do the robin's egg blue, really just on the flowers down here at the bottom. So anytime I'm glazing, I want to check the lid first. This is a high school classroom, and you don't know what the person before you did. So make sure that the lid is screwed on tight and that the threads are matching so that the lid is actually secure. Then what I want to do is put my finger on top of the lid, and then I want to shake the glaze and listen to that. You want to hear that kind of noise because that means the glaze is not too thick and not too thin. If it makes a more watery noise, you know that the glaze is too thin and you probably should not use it. If the glaze does not move at all, then it is too thick and you need to add a small amount of hot water to it and wait until the next day. This glaze is actually very new, so I'm going to go ahead and open it. And then the rule for most glazes is that you always want to use 3 coats. And unlike paint, it's not going to be bonded to the clay. So glaze actually has a little bit of clay in it, and that's what is going to cause it to bond to your ceramic piece in the kiln. But right now, I'm just going to kind of float my brush across the surface of my piece and make a layer. You also want to think about brush strokes. So if I'm doing 3 coats, on the first coat, I want to go left to right. And I'm just kind of floating my fan brush across my piece. I want to be very aware of all the little nooks and crannies and make sure I get glaze in all of those spots. And I'm using a white glaze, so it is going to be a little bit difficult to see what I'm doing. So I want to work quickly enough that I can see what part of the piece is very shiny and wet looking so that I get glaze in all of those areas. And any of these little areas where I'm going back over it, it's because the glaze is a little bit thick right there. So I'm trying to spread it out to get a nice consistent layer. And I would do the same thing on the other side. So it's kind of hard to see on camera because it is white, but I have glazed that piece. And I chose this glaze for this piece because I do have a texture that I've put on the front of this cross. And so this opalescent glaze is going to break over that texture, and you're going to see some really nice color variation when it comes out of the kiln. Because this side has texture, I'm having to actually brush both directions to get inside all the little nooks and crannies. So that's okay. On the next layer, what I'm going to do is, since I went to side or left to right on this layer, I'm now going to go up and down on the second layer. So you just want to be aware of your brush strokes. And if you forgot which direction you went the first time, you can usually look and see little tiny lines in the glaze to figure out which direction you need to go the next time. After you've done that layer, you actually want to take a break. You don't want to try to immediately put a second layer on your piece. If you do that, you're not actually putting a layer on your piece, you're just smearing around the glaze that's already there. So one of the things you need to practice in ceramics is patience. So once I put on my first layer, I actually want to do something else, maybe work on one of my projects or complete a sketch or do some of my work that I have to do for ceramics class and let this piece get completely dry. When it is no longer reflecting light, which my piece is still reflecting light because it has not been very long, it is wet. So while the piece is wet, I want to leave it alone and wait until the glaze is dry and chalky looking to try to put on a second coat. The first coat is going to dry very quickly. The third coat, you're going to have to wait quite a bit of time, maybe 30 minutes or longer before you can do that third coat. Because you already have so much glaze on the piece, it takes longer for the glaze to dry. Once you've put on your third coat, you can actually take your thumb and smooth out anything that is not perfect. So you want to rub it, and some of the glaze is actually going to come off on your finger and look dusty. And you can do that anywhere that the glaze looks like it's a little bit too thick or uneven. You can also take your brush and just fix little tiny areas if you can still see the clay. You want to make sure that your layers of glaze are very consistent and that you have 3 nice full layers so that when it gets fired in the kiln, none of the clay shows back through the glaze. That is everything about glazing that you need to know. Go out there and glaze your pieces. Once your piece has dried and you've gotten 3 coats of glaze on your piece and you're ready to turn it in, there's one more thing that you need to do. Gravity is going to cause the glaze to move and drip after you have put it on your piece. So you always need to check the bottom to make sure that no glaze is on it before turning it into the kiln. If there's glaze left on the bottom of your piece when it is fired in the kiln, that is also going to melt, and instead of fusing to your piece, it's going to fuse to the kiln shelf. If your piece fuses to the kiln shelf, it will ruin your piece, it will ruin the kiln shelf, and it possibly will ruin other people's work as well. If you cause our kiln shelf to be ruined, you will have to buy us another one. They're very expensive, so you always want to make sure that you do this step. You want to take a damp sponge and you want to just wipe the bottom of your piece. And if you have any glaze on the bottom, it's going to come right off because your piece has not been fired. So always clean the bottom of your piece. If you have a lot of glaze on the bottom of your piece, you can actually take sandpaper and sand the glaze off the bottom of your piece.